For every war in history, there is an iconic weapon associated with it. Whether that's the machine gun of World War I, the tanks and planes of the Second World War, or the helicopters of the Vietnam War. And for the Dominion War, the iconic weapon was the attack ship. It's funny to think then that for how iconic attack ships were during the Dominion War, that for the majority of the war, Starfleet never had a dedicated attack ship. But you know what they say, better late than never. Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today we'll be taking a look at the Interceptor Class attack ship from the Dominion War. This is a fan-designed ship designed by Stuart Baldwin. And this very much fills the role of a modern Starfleet attack ship. So what I'm going to do in this video today is go into the history of the attack ship, where does it come from, and most critically, why was the Federation so slow to get on board with the idea of attack ships, and why was the Interceptor so late to the party? So without any further ado, let's get into it. The first thing to mention is that in the run-up to the Dominion War, people could see attack ships beginning to gain prominence. First, it was foreshadowed by the Marquis, particularly when it came to the use of the larger Condor. That is much closer to attack ship size, although still quite small at only about 60 meters long. But you can start to see the idea of large numbers of small attack ships being able to swarm and overwhelm larger vessels. It was then demonstrated on still a relatively small scale by the Jem'hadar. First, of course, with the destruction of the USS Odyssey. 3 Jem'hadar fighters, through superior weapons and technology, were able to take down the much larger USS Odyssey. Although I will admit the USS Odyssey held out pretty well against the Jem'hadar fighters. The Galaxy class is certainly not the glass cannon people speculate it to be. They would also prove that even further with the Battle of the Omarion Nebula, taking down a large fleet of heavy cruisers and battleships with just fighters. And then it was proven at scale by the Klingons, using large numbers of birds of prey to support their invasion of Cardassia. And of course the interesting thing to note there is that the bird of prey is a much older design and wasn't actually built as an attack ship. It was very much pressed into that role, probably after the Klingons had observed how effective Jem'hadar fighters could be. Birds of prey prior to that, during the 23rd century, were very much just ambush ships. They were U-boats, but they really transform in the 24th century into attack boats, so to speak. So during the Dominion War, some powers placed more emphasis on the attack ship than others. The two powers who place the most emphasis on their attack ships are the Klingons and the Dominion, making use of the bird of prey and Jem'hadar fighter respectively. Both of these are really one of the primary weapons of the fleet. With the Klingons, generally birds of prey are the supporting element to whatever they are following, whether that's a Katinga or a Vocha. And in the case of the Dominion, no, the attack ships are the primary weapon, and they are supported by the cruisers. This contrasts greatly with the Romulans and Cardassians, who very much have them in a defensive role. Attack ships in their mind is just to cover the larger ships, and otherwise is just to stay out the way, really. They don't put a huge amount of stock on large numbers of attack ships. They don't really have the means to produce the requisite number, nor do they have the sort of strategic or doctrinal incentive to do so. Their doctrine doesn't really support that kind of use of attack ships. Now, when it comes to the Federation, they very much relied on destroyers. So we're looking at Sabre and Miranda. These are two very good ships for their time, but they are destroyers. They are larger, they are heavier, they are slower, and you still need attack ships to balance that out. The inventory of attack ships is quite small. You've basically got two options. One that is very expensive, being the Defiant, and one that is very old, being the Akiazi. That's really what you've got to pick between. The Defiant, which you can't actually field in the requisite numbers to serve as a mainline attack ship, and the Akiazi, which you do have in the requisite numbers, but is very old and very flimsy. It's about the same level of durability as a bird of prey, and in the Dominion War, that's not saying much. The bird of prey is probably the weakest of all the attack ships and only survives on the basis of its speed, agility, and firepower, is very limited in terms of its own defences. And the same goes for the Ikyazi. So this really brings us to the problem of the Defiant. As I say, the Defiant is costly to build and costly to operate. Defiant class ships are arguably almost bespoke build. They aren't built at scale because you can't afford to build them at scale, so each one tends to be a little bit individual, so they don't tend to work very well with green crews. They like to cook off if they're improperly operated. They like to overheat and explode or generally shake themselves apart. Each Defiant needs a good shakedown cruise so that the crew can actually get accustomed to what the individual ship wants. They also, compared to other attack ships, lack speed and agility. The Defiant is a heavily armoured vessel, which is good when you're taking on board cubes, but it means that basically it is going to be less manoeuvrable than every other attack ship out there, barring the Hideki. But pretty much every other attack ship is going to be more agile than the Defiant. And so the Defiant isn't really an attack ship in the conventional sense. It's better to describe it as a breakthrough vessel. So it can help them sort of overwhelm enemy formations of attack ships and also punch through areas that other attack ships can't, which is good, but you need something to follow along. The Defiant is much less like an attack ship and really is more similar to the heavy bird of prey that the Klingons have, the Norg. And again, kind of fills that role of being slightly upgunned and heavier, of course trading in speed and maneuverability for that. Which, as I say, is fine, particularly when the Defiant is working with destroyers. But it does mean that it's relegated from doing a lot of attack ship things that, more dedicated attack ships could probably take on and do far better than the Defiant. So Starfleet wants an alternative to the Defiant. They want it to be cheaper, faster and more agile, and able to support aggressive reconnaissance and exploitation. And it also needs to be more user-friendly to new crews. Part of the personnel problem in Starfleet is not just a lack of people, but it's actually a lack of correctly trained people, particularly for more specialist vessels. So if this new ship can be easier to operate, that will lighten that burden and mean that they can just take pretty much anyone and free up the specialists for vessels that really need specialists. And that, of course, leads us to the Interceptor Class. It is 165 meters long and 86 meters wide. It has about 9 decks and is armed with 11 phaser strips. It has a fore and aft torpedo launcher, and it has 2 pulse phasers. Now that's half of what the Defiant has. The Defiant has 4 pulse phasers. So that does mean that with pulse phasers alone, you are looking at double the time to kill. But you also have a far more extensive array of phasers. And the way these ships are going to be operating, the longer time to kill, it doesn't really matter so much. The Defiant needs that quick time to kill because if it doesn't, it's going to be facing return fire because it can't evade. It also features variable warp geometry, so very similar to the Intrepid class. In fact, a lot of the Interceptor in design is based off of the Intrepid class, just on a much smaller scale. And it has a crew of about 84 people. So again, more than the Defiant, which does lean it technically out of the attack ship range at over 165 meters long. Technically, that would lead you more into a destroyer, but given the overall mass and still comparatively small size, you can just about squeeze it in to the range of an attack ship, and it does still fit. So what we get here in terms of capability is an ability to match the Jem'hadar fighter at range and the Klingon bird of prey with its pulse phasers. Not that you're fighting Klingon birds of prey, but it gives you that ability to follow the Klingon bird of prey, which is very important, particularly as joint operations are becoming more and more commonplace later into the war. So what we get here is a very small, narrow profile that is more on par with other attack ships. As I say, the Defiant was more similar to a heavy bird of prey, if not a destroyer, in terms of its capabilities. But it paid for that in lacking a lot of the other facilities that a attack ship should have. Attack ships are meant to be quite universal platforms that you can deploy very easily to do almost anything, at least on a very small scale. The Defiant couldn't really do that because of how, again, specialised it was. The Defiant ultimately comes from the anti-Borg fleet, which is a fleet chock full of heavily specialised ships, whereas the Interceptor is very much like the Intrepid, that it's based on a more generalist build, and that gives it a lot more engagement options. So for example, if you're coming up against enemy ships that have relatively short-range weapons, well, you can avoid the short-range weapons and just engage with your phaser arrays. So for example, if there's a wing of Cardassian destroyers, which will melt you at close range, well, you just stand off them. You have the speed, you have the maneuverability, you can just stand off those Cardassian destroyers and hit them with phasers at range. Similarly, if you're facing Jem'hadar fighters, which tend to like engaging at medium range with their own Polaron phasers, where you close that gap and you can engage them up close and personal with your pulse phasers, and the Jem'hadar don't really have a good response to that, especially when you're just as maneuverable and agile, if not more so than they are. It's a real jack of all trades. Now, I can already tell somebody saying, but a jack of all trades, master of none. However, and this is a large however, you need to bear in mind that an Interceptor class is never going to work alone. Interceptors will of course be supported by their own kind, and this really acts as a force multiplier, again because they have this spread of capabilities with torpedoes, with phasers, with pulse phasers. But also, they're going to be working with larger vessels. What this means is you have a ship that can really serve as an effective force multiplier. They can follow Defiance into a charge. They can work with sabers as hunter-killers. They can go in force recons protecting the Nova-class reconnaissance vessels, or support Intrepids in exploitation operations, in a way that the Defiant never was capable of doing, because the Defiant was so, as I say, specialised. And it's very difficult for anyone to hard counter the Interceptor in a way that you could with more specialist ships. With designs like the Defiant, it was actually quite easy to counter them. You just had to match them off against a ship that could do their job better, because they had no ability to change tack, because they were built for one thing. So if you have a ship that can do the Defiant's job better, and you put it up against the Defiant, well, the Defiant's going to lose. But the Interceptor has the option of changing tactics and adapting to that situation, which makes it very difficult to counter and pin down. So just to really wrap up, it's worth saying that most attack ships in the Dominion War didn't start out as attack ships. They were all generally forced into an emergent role that people saw developing, and the various powers of the Alpha Quadrant basically then made do with what they had, whether that's the Defiant being an anti-Borg ship pressed into that role of an attack ship, whether that's the Romulans retooling their attack ships to serve as escorts for the larger battleships, or the Klingons taking their old ambush bird of prey and converting it into a large-scale swarm attack vessel. Each of these are real just hodgepodges of older designs to kind of keep them relevant, and because you happen to have large numbers of them. And some of these ships took to their new role better than others. But Interceptor was built for this. It took Starfleet from having no real attack ship to having arguably the best attack ship of the war, capable of doing pretty much everything that all the other attack ships could do. Not necessarily better, but it could do all of the jobs, unlike other attack ships that had relatively narrow capabilities originating from their older designs that didn't really anticipate the emergence of the attack ship. And this really reflects the ability of Starfleet to learn and adapt. And again, when it comes to the post-war world, Interceptor serves as a considerable force multiplier, far better than the Defiant ever could. The Defiant was a dedicated warship, but the Interceptor as an attack ship, like I say, has a broad range of capabilities and is able to handle a lot of duties close to home, whether that's patrol, scientific research. All these kind of duties that would have had to be done by larger cruisers are now done by the Interceptor class, and that frees up, again, those larger cruisers to go out and do exploration in a way that they couldn't before. And that's, again, an example of how technology improves, and indeed a good example of miniaturization. And so in that way, the Interceptor is not just a great warship, but a great Federation starship. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My devoted Navarks, Jeffrey Ballard, Tully DT, Rella, and David Reeves. My dutiful commanders, Captain's Quarters, Philip Tye, Bird Monster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Norata, Adam Bowman, Nathaniel Mead, DM Tribal Typhoon, Gabe Logan, Nicholas Walsh, JC Tech Wizard, Rizal 3D, and James C. And I salute my loyal Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Okokatum Coesto, Squadra Course, John Nicole, Athys Collection, Tobias Klein, Greg Martin, and Shermos. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.